Thank you, thank you. I'm Dr. Ted Naiman, and I'm here today to talk to you about protein versus energy. Protein versus energy, what does that even mean? Well, in order to explain this, we're going to start at the very beginning. What is eating? This is as basic as it gets. What is eating? So, plants are autotrophs. Plants make their own food. Animals, on the other hand, are heterotrophs, which means they have to continually eat other living organisms just to be alive. That's right, you and I are animals, and we're only alive because we constantly eat other living things. That's just how the system works. So all animals can be divided into herbivores, carnivores, or omnivores. But no matter what kind of animal you are, plants are at the base of all animal nutrition. Now, plants don't want to be at the base of all animal nutrition, but they are. That's just how it goes. Herbivores are predators of plants, and they have to make all the food for all the animals. What plants do is take carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, the three biggest elements of life, and they use them to make all of their own food. In addition, plants are getting about 24 other mineral elements from soil, which are all required for plant and animal life. So in a way, plants are getting everything they need from the soil except for nitrogen. Plants are getting everything from the soil except for carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The most important mineral plants are getting from the soil is nitrogen, which is fundamental. It's a part of amino acids, which make up all of our proteins. Now, similarly, your human body has about 24 elements in it that all originate from soil, and the three biggest elements are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which come from air and water. So your plant is getting carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, the three biggest elements of plant and animal life, from air and water, specifically carbon dioxide in the air and water. And then plants are getting nitrogen for protein and other minerals from the soil. Now, plants store energy, and they store solar energy from the sun as chemical energy. That's what photosynthesis is. Plants take solar energy, and they use carbon from carbon dioxide in the air, and they store chains of carbons, and that's all dietary energy. Every bit of energy we eat is high energy carbon-carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds that are stored by plants using sunlight and carbon from carbon dioxide. So everything that we burn for energy to run our metabolism, these carbohydrates and hydrocarbons, which are really just fats, are all made by plants, and they're chains of high energy carbons that we are constantly burning in our mitochondria. Animals break apart these carbon-carbon bonds in our mitochondria using oxygen. We oxidize or burn these carbon fats in our mitochondria, and it releases energy as well as it gives off carbon dioxide and water, which we exhale. So all animals are continually burning these carbohydrates and fats in our mitochondria. Actually, when you think about it, anything on Earth that can burn or be oxidized, where you add oxygen and get energy plus carbon dioxide and water, was made by a plant, and it originated from solar energy. If you burn gasoline or wood or oil, all of these carbon energy sources were created by plants, and their chemical energy stored from solar energy. So plants make all of our energy. Plants make every bit of dietary energy that we use to run our lives. Plants are also making all of our protein. They're absorbing nitrogen as a mineral from soil, and they're using that to build amino acids, which are the building blocks of all of our proteins. So your plant is here absorbing nitrogen for protein and other minerals from the soil, and then it's sequestering carbon energy from sunlight using carbon dioxide in the air. Plants draw nitrogen and minerals up from the nitrogen and mineral nutrient pool in topsoil and incorporate them into their bodies. And then they store carbon energy from solar energy using carbon dioxide and store that in their bodies as well. And when animals eat the plants, all of this protein and nitrogen and minerals and carbon energy is passed up to the herbivore. And then when a carnivore eats an herbivore, it all gets passed up to the carnivore. And then anytime anything dies, it gets decomposed by bacteria and fungi and goes back into the nitrogen and mineral nutrient pool. So the green arrows here show the nitrogen cycle, and the red arrows show the carbon cycle, and this is just how the whole system works. So your plant could be thought of as having a protein to energy ratio or a nitrogen to carbon ratio. And in fact, plants do have a nitrogen to carbon ratio. And similarly, your human body could be thought of as having a protein to energy ratio or a nitrogen to carbon ratio. And in fact, we do have this ratio inside our bodies. Everyone's body is designed to have a certain percentage of protein and then a certain percentage of energy. If you are healthy, protein is going to be higher than energy. If you are overweight or obese, then energy might be higher than protein. Or if you don't have enough muscle tissue or lean mass, then protein might be lower than energy. Plants concentrate nutrients from soil. They are absorbing nitrogen and minerals and concentrating them in their bodies. But they are limited by how far their roots can reach, so they can only concentrate so much. Animals don't have this limitation. They can walk around and eat all the plants they want, so we see even higher concentrations of nitrogen and minerals in animals. This is called bioaccumulation or biomagnification. Just like mercury accumulates in ocean fish as you go up the food chain, you see higher and higher contents of nitrogen and minerals and protein in animals than you do in plants. This is why animal foods are typically higher in nutrient density than plant foods. If you look at the protein to energy ratio in plants versus herbivores versus carnivores, you always see the highest protein to energy ratio in predators or carnivores. They have the highest lean mass and the lowest fat mass. And that's just how the system works. Now, humans are apex predators, or at least we were apex predators prior to the agriculture revolution about 10,000 years ago. Let's talk for a second about nutritional ecology. Nutritional ecology is the science of what an animal needs to eat versus what it gets to eat. Imagine you have an animal that has access to a food that's mostly protein and another food that's mostly energy. Well, this animal is going to have some sort of nutrient fitness target where it functions optimally and has the best chance of reproducing. And this animal is going to combine these two foods in a complementary fashion, eating a little bit of both in order to hit its fitness target. And this is what every free-living animal on Earth is doing every day, whether it knows it or not. The problem arises if you were to cage this animal and only offer it the low-protein food. Now the animal has to make a choice or a compromise. Am I going to overeat energy and risk obesity just to get enough protein? Or am I going to undereat protein so I don't become obese, but then maybe my function and my reproduction is limited? In the case of humans, we always overeat energy in order to get enough protein. That's just how we're wired. Back in the Paleolithic, which is the time period just before agriculture was invented, in the Paleolithic, or the pre-agricultural time, we had very high protein diets. If we dumped you off in the wilderness with nothing but a spear, you would realize very quickly that about 98% of all plant foods on Earth are poisonous and toxic to humans, and as a result, you'd be killing animals and eating them predominantly. So prior to agriculture, we had very high protein diets, a high reliance on animal foods. In fact, we were frequently energy constrained. We did not get enough energy in our diets. We were always looking for more energy. And humans have always used technology to feed ourselves. So we invented stone tools so we could break open long bones and eat bone marrow and get more fat, or break open skulls and eat brains for higher fat content, or dig up tubers using tools to get starch. Eventually, we used our intelligence to invent agriculture, and we figured out how to domesticate plants and grow starch. And with the advent of agriculture, we diluted the protein in our diet because we figured out how to grow these starches, and the protein to energy ratio of our diet went down considerably. As a result, we had some negative health consequences. We had shorter stature, smaller brains, and poorer health of bones and teeth with the advent of agriculture. Eventually, humans took things way too far with the Industrial Revolution and the bulk refining and transport of sugar, flour, and oil. And the protein dilution in our diets now is absolutely terrible. We have very low protein to energy ratios of our diets, and we also have very low protein to energy ratios of our bodies. One of the problems with agriculture is we preferentially like the parts of plants that are the highest in energy, the roots and the tubers and the nuts and the seeds and the fruit. And we cultivate all of these plants to maximize the energy yield. Corn, for example, is this ridiculously high energy food. You can just squeeze it and make corn syrup and corn oil out of it. So our food today has so much more energy in it than it used to. The reality is that plants store energy, and we like to eat energy, and we cultivate plants to maximize the energy yield. And as if that weren't bad enough, we refine and process all of these foods as well to get as much energy out of them as possible. And by the time we're done, the amount of energy we get for the amount of protein and minerals is just ridiculous. Let's talk about the 3 macronutrients for a minute: protein, carbs, and fats. If you graph out all of your food on the 3 macronutrient axes, what you'll find is that protein tracks very well with minerals and nutrient density. The higher you go in protein, the higher your nutrient density becomes. The opposite is not true. The higher you go in a carbs plus fat direction, the lower the mineral and nutrient content. And in fact, the more likely you are to get a man-made food that's very low in nutrient density and highly obesogenic. We know from human and animal studies that if you feed an omnivore mammal carbs and fats together, it will immediately get fatter. And the opposite is also true. If you feed an omnivore mammal a higher protein percentage, it will immediately get thinner. Now, so far we've lumped energy together. Carbs and fats we've just called energy. But the reality is that carbs and fats are very different in the body. You have 2 totally separate storage compartments in your body. Carbohydrates are broken down into monosaccharides like glucose before they're absorbed, and then we store them in our liver and our muscles as glycogen, which is basically a human starch, just chains of glucose. Glycogen is water soluble, and it has an entirely separate storage compartment from fat, which is not water soluble and is stored in our adipocytes. So your body has these 2 entirely separate storage compartments for the 2 forms of energy, carbs and fats. Glycogen, which is the glucose stored in our liver and muscles, is very special. It's incredibly fast. You can make energy out of glycogen 6 times faster than you can fat. So glycogen is extremely valuable. But fully hydrated glycogen, and we call them carbohydrates because they're fully hydrated, they're very heavy, they're very large. Glycogen is not a very size and weight efficient way to store energy. So we have this situation where glucose is 6 times faster at making energy than fat is, but it's 6 times larger and heavier. So your body wants a little bit of both, but we carry about 100 times more energy as fat because it's so much easier to carry around. This photo shows olive oil and potatoes, and the lipid droplet in your adipocytes is very similar to this olive oil, and the glycogen stored in your liver and muscles is very similar to the potatoes here. And this is an equivalent amount of energy, but you can see that the glycogen is 6 times larger and heavier than the fat is for the same amount of energy. This is why your body likes to carry around most of your energy as fat. But you always want some glucose, some glycogen on board for emergency use. If you're just sedentary or walking around, you're mostly burning fat. But at higher intensities of exercise, carbohydrate usage goes up higher and higher. And if you're sprinting for your life, you are always using 100% pure glucose from glycogen. This is why you always have to have some glucose around. But because it's so heavy and hard to carry, glycogen storage is 100 times smaller than fat storage inside your body. And because it's so much smaller, glycogen exerts a leverage over fat, and it completely controls which fuel is being oxidized in your body at all times. If you're eating more glucose and you have more glycogen, you have to burn more glucose. And if you're eating less glucose, you have to burn more fat. For example, if you're eating a high-carb, low-fat diet, you're eating lots of carbohydrates, glycogen's very high, and that shuts off or displaces fat oxidation. So you're mostly having to burn glucose because you don't have any more room for it. The opposite is true. If you're eating a low-carbohydrate diet and glycogen's low, then you automatically have to burn more fat. Glucose and fat are oxidized reciprocally. When more glucose is present, you burn more glucose. When less glucose is present, you have to burn more fat. The worst, of course, is a high-carb and a high-fat diet. This is a huge problem. Unfortunately, this is the way we eat in America. We eat a very high carbohydrate diet, so glycogen's always high, which displaces fat oxidation, so we're not burning fat. But we're still eating fat, so the fat is slowly accumulating. And that's why everybody in America is gaining weight at about 1 to 3 pounds a year. We know from human and animal studies that diets that are high in fat and high in carbs together are extremely obesogenic, and this is the problem we have in America right now. High fat plus high carb plus high energy diets equals hyperphagia, which is overeating. You can take any human or any omnivore mammal and feed it a diet high in fat, high in carbs, and high in energy density, and it will automatically overeat by about 30% of calories and become obese. Now, this is a graph of obesity in America, and somewhere back in the 1970s, something happened and obesity took off. What was it? If you look at the macronutrients back then, you will see that carbohydrates started taking off and fat started taking off, and that was because we dumped a bunch of sugar, flour, and oil into the food supply, and we diluted protein significantly. Carbs and fats went up, but protein really did not go up, and this led to protein dilution in our food. In fact, if you look at the protein percentage, it went down from 14% to 12.5% over the past 50 years of the obesity epidemic. Now, two researchers in Australia, Drs. Raubenheimer and Simpson, published this article about 10 years ago on their protein leverage hypothesis. They realized if you drop protein percentage from 14 to 12.5%, you have to eat about 15% more energy to get the same amount of protein, and that leads to obesity. And this explains about a big percentage of the obesity problem in our country. If you look at worldwide hunter-gatherer macronutrient estimations, hunter-gatherers were eating 19 to 35% protein because they had such a high animal diet and a high protein diet. Contrast that with the standard American diet right now, which is 12.5%. This is the standard American diet right now: 100 grams of protein a day, 100 grams of fat a day, and 300 grams of carbohydrates. This is part of why we have a problem. Now, Raubenheimer and Simpson did a meta-analysis where they looked at over 100 studies where humans ate as much as they wanted, and someone tracked their macronutrients. And what you see is this incredibly narrow line of protein prioritization. Basically, humans eat until they get enough protein, and only then do they stop eating. When you graph out protein percentage on an energy intake heat map, like Raubenheimer and Simpson did, you see that protein is on the x-axis here, protein percentage. The higher your protein percentage, the less energy you eat, and the lower your protein percentage, the more energy you eat. They found the very highest energy intakes at a low protein of 10% and a high carbohydrate of 50%. And they saw the very lowest energy intakes at a high protein intake of 50% and a low carbohydrate intake of 10%. So everyone's eating enough protein to be alive. We know we're eating enough protein to be alive. But the question is, how much energy did you have to eat to get that protein? Raubenheimer and Simpson made another economic discovery. They graphed out the price of everything in the grocery store based on macronutrients, and you have protein on the x-axis. And what you see here is that the more protein in a food, the more expensive it is. And this is why obesity and poverty frequently go hand in hand. I have devised a method of graphing out various foods with a protein to energy ratio, protein on the y-axis and energy on the x-axis. And when you do this, some very interesting things pop up. First of all, ground beef, for example. This is ground beef at various protein percentages and fat percentages. And these are all excellent foods. But one of the problems is that grains are not very good. This is all of your grains: oats, wheat, rice, corn. They're all fairly terrible. And 60% of our calories in America are coming from these cereal grains. It's a big problem. The green arrow here is the standard hunter-gatherer diet worldwide, and the red arrow is the standard American diet. Now let's look at a couple studies where we actually looked at protein percentage and the outcomes in humans. This is a diet study in obesity, 12% protein versus 25% protein, with ad lib calories, which means you ate as much as you wanted. Here's the weight loss in 12% versus 25%. As you can see, higher protein is always better, even when you're eating as much as you want. And look at intra-abdominal fat loss on the high protein diet. It's dramatically superior. Here's another study in obesity, 15% protein versus 30% protein, again, as many calories as you want. And the high protein group ate less, lost more weight, and had lower hunger scores at the same time, which is absolutely amazing. Here's a study in pre-diabetics, 15% protein versus 30% protein. The high protein group lost more weight, but amazingly, the high protein group had a 100% pre-diabetes reversal rate. And the study authors said, to the best of their knowledge, nobody had ever gotten a 100% pre-diabetes reversal rate ever doing anything. Here's another study in type 2 diabetics, 15% versus 30% protein. Eat as much as you want. The high protein group immediately lost more weight, lowered their blood sugar, lowered their triglycerides. Here's another study in type 2 diabetics. These authors realized, hey, protein lowers people's blood sugars. 15% versus 30% protein. The high protein group had a 40% drop in glucose area under the curve and a dramatic decrease in their hemoglobin A1C, or 3-month glucose average. Here's a study in satiety, high protein 25% versus normal protein 14%. And what they found is that protein reduces cravings. The cravings were less than 50% in the high protein group. Obsessive thoughts of food, late night desire to eat. Here's a look at actual satiety hunger scores with the 3 macronutrients. The red line here is protein in lean and obese people, and these hunger scores are the lowest in protein, fat was second, carbs were the worst, of course. What about weight loss maintenance? Here's a study in weight loss maintenance. They took a group of people who'd lost weight, and they randomized them to either continue the same diet or just add an extra 48 grams of protein to their diet, which is maybe 1 or 2 chicken breasts. What happened? Well, 4 months later, the high protein group had 50% less fat regain, higher lean mass, and lower hunger scores all at the same time. This is absolutely magical. Here's another study in weight loss maintenance. They took people who had lost weight and randomized them into 4 groups: high protein, low protein, high carb, and low carb. 6 months later, the only group that maintained their weight loss was the high protein, low carb group. Every other group gained their weight back. Of course, the worst was the low protein, high carb group. We know that low carb diets are effective for weight loss, but what about protein percentage in a low carb setting? This 1-year study looked at 15 versus 30% low carb diets with identical calories and identical low level of carbohydrate. And what they found is that the high protein group was dramatically better than the low protein group at everything you could measure: weight, body fat percentage, insulin, triglycerides, HDL or good cholesterol, hunger scores, emotional eating. High protein is always better. When it comes to protein, too much protein is always better than too little protein. In fact, there's really no such thing as too much protein. In 20 years of medical practice, I have never once looked at a patient and said, you're eating too much protein. It's really not even a thing. Now, too little protein is definitely something I see almost every single day in my practice. And the biggest group that suffers from too little protein is older American adults. Almost half of Americans over the age of 50 do not eat adequate protein. And this is a graph of the actual macronutrient intake in American adults aged 70 to 79. And they're only getting 66 grams of protein a day, which is below the world average, and only 38 grams of highly bioavailable animal protein. Instead, they're eating 247 grams of carbohydrates. This is probably why we have epidemics of sarcopenia and osteopenia, low muscle and low bone, and type 2 diabetes in older Americans. Speaking of type 2 diabetes, this is a disease that is 100% preventable. How do you prevent diabetes? You increase the nutrient to energy ratio of your diet. You see, type 2 diabetes is simply exceeding your ability to store energy in your body. You've overfilled your fat stores, you've overfilled your carbohydrate stores. It's energy toxicity. Type 2 diabetes is energy toxicity. And when you increase the nutrient to energy ratio of your diet, you will prevent this disease completely. Protein is the most essential nutrient of all. Whole food fat is also an essential nutrient. Carbohydrates exist only to provide added energy to the diet, and in fact, the requirement for carbohydrates in human diet is 0. Added fat, similarly, exists only to provide added energy. So every time you eat, you have a choice. You can feed your muscle or you can feed your fat. If you eat protein, you're going to feed your muscle. If you eat carbs and fats, this is pure energy, and you're feeding your fat tissue. So you really have a choice every time you eat. You are what you eat. If you eat mostly energy, you're going to be mostly energy. And if you eat mostly protein, you're going to be mostly protein. And that's all I have on protein versus energy. Thank you very much.